They laughed when I left the orphanage homeless, until I received the key to my grandmother's farm. I still remember the sound of their laughter echoing behind me as I walked through those iron gates for the last time. Rebecca Morrison, 18 years old, officially aged out of the foster care system, with nothing but a duffel bag containing 3 shirts, 2 pairs of jeans, and a photograph of a woman I barely remembered. The social workers had that look in their eyes, the one that said they'd seen this story 1,000 times before. Another kid about to become another statistic, another forgotten face in a broken system that chews people up and spits them out without a second thought. The group home had been my residence for the past 4 years, ever since my mother died when I was 14. Before that, it had been a rotation of foster families who either couldn't handle me or couldn't afford another mouth to feed. I wasn't a bad kid, not really. I just had this habit of asking too many questions and not accepting things at face value. That tends to make adults uncomfortable, especially the ones who are supposed to have all the answers but clearly don't. My mother used to call it my superpower. This inability to just go along with things that didn't make sense. She said I got it from my grandmother, a woman I'd only met twice in my entire life, both times when I was too young to really remember much, beyond a kind smile and hands that smelled like lavender and soil. The morning I turned 18, Mrs. Patterson, the head administrator, called me into her office with that practiced, sympathetic expression she'd perfected over 20 years of delivering bad news to vulnerable children. She explained that I had exactly 72 hours to vacate my room, that they needed the space for a younger child, someone with more time in the system, someone they might actually be able to help. She handed me a folder with information about homeless shelters, job training programs, and a list of churches that served free meals. Then she wished me luck in that tone people use when they don't actually believe you have any chance of success. I took the folder, thanked her politely, and walked back to my room to pack up the scattered pieces of my life. My roommate, Jenny, was already gone. She'd left 3 weeks earlier to live with an aunt in Colorado, who'd finally gotten her life together enough to pass a background check. Jenny had been one of the good ones, someone who actually listened when I talked, instead of just waiting for her turn to speak. On my last night, she'd hugged me tight and made me promise to stay in touch. But we both knew how these things went. People drift apart when they're no longer forced together by circumstance. That's just how the world works. Still, as I folded my clothes and stuffed them into that ancient duffel bag, I found a note she'd left under my pillow. It said, "You're stronger than you think, Becca. Don't let them make you believe otherwise." I cried for the first time in 3 years. The other kids at the group home weren't as kind. Marcus and Tyler, 2 brothers who'd been there almost as long as me, stood in the hallway making bets about how long it would take before I ended up strung out on drugs or pregnant with some loser's baby. Sarah, who'd always been jealous of the fact that I actually studied and got decent grades, loudly announced that she gave me 2 months before I came crawling back, begging them to take me in again. Even some of the younger kids, the ones I'd helped with homework and protected from bullies, looked at me with a mixture of pity and fear, like my failure was contagious and they might catch it if they got too close. Nobody wanted to be associated with the girl who was about to disappear into the statistics they showed us in those mandatory life skills classes. I left on a Tuesday morning in late September, when the air had that crisp bite that signals summer's definitive end. The sky was that perfect shade of blue that makes you believe anything is possible, which felt like a cruel joke given my circumstances. I'd managed to save up about $300 from the part-time job I'd had at the library, shelving books and helping elderly patrons navigate the computer system. It wasn't much, but it was something. Mrs. Chen, the head librarian, had tried to convince me to apply for community college, said I was too smart to waste my potential. But what was I supposed to do? Live in my car while I studied? I didn't even have a car. The reality was that I needed a job. Any job, and I needed it immediately. Education was a luxury for people who had safety nets, and I was working without one. I spent my first night of freedom, if you could call it that, on a bench in Riverside Park. It wasn't as bad as you might think. The weather was still relatively mild, and I'd chosen a spot near a streetlight where I felt reasonably safe. I kept my bag close and didn't sleep much, just dozed in and out while watching the city move around me. There's something humbling about becoming invisible. People walked past me without a second glance, probably assuming I was just some teenager waiting for friends or killing time before heading home. They had no idea I didn't have a home to go to. Around midnight, a police officer stopped and asked if I was okay. I lied and said I was waiting for my mom to pick me up from a friend's house. He looked skeptical, but didn't push it. I guess he had bigger problems to deal with than one more homeless kid. The next morning, I used the bathroom at a McDonald's to wash my face and brush my teeth, trying to make myself presentable enough to job hunt. My reflection in that harsh fluorescent lighting showed a girl who looked older than 18, with dark circles under green eyes that had seen too much too soon. My brown hair needed a proper wash, but I did my best with wet paper towels and the tiny bottle of shampoo I'd taken from the group home. I changed into my cleanest clothes and practiced smiling in the mirror, trying to look like someone employable, someone trustworthy, someone who wouldn't steal from the register or show up late every day. The girl staring back at me wasn't convinced. I spent the next week applying everywhere: fast food joints, retail stores, warehouses, cleaning services, anywhere that might hire someone with a GED and zero experience. Most places took one look at my application, noticed the lack of a permanent address, and suddenly remembered they weren't actually hiring right now, despite the help wanted sign in the window. A few were more direct about it, explaining that they needed someone reliable, someone who wouldn't be a liability, someone who had their life together. I wanted to scream that I was trying to get my life together, that you can't get your life together without a job, but that would have just confirmed their suspicions that I was unstable. So I smiled, thanked them for their time, and moved on to the next rejection. By the end of that first week, my $300 had dwindled to $140. I'd been eating as cheaply as possible, mostly dollar menu items and convenience store snacks, but money disappears faster than you'd think when you're living on the streets. I'd found a youth shelter that let me stay for up to 5 nights, which helped, but their beds were first come, first served, and I'd already missed out twice because I'd been too far away when the doors opened at 6 p.m. The shelter was clean enough, and the staff tried to be helpful, but there's only so much they could do with limited resources and an endless stream of kids just like me, all competing for the same scarce opportunities. On day 9 of my newfound independence, I finally caught a break. A convenience store on the edge of downtown needed someone for overnight shifts, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., stocking shelves and manning the register during the dead hours when most decent people were asleep in their warm beds. The pay was minimum wage, $8.75 an hour, which meant I'd be making about $70 a night before taxes. The manager, a tired-looking man named Frank, who was probably in his 50s but looked 70, didn't ask too many questions about my living situation. He just needed someone who could show up on time and wouldn't steal from him. I promised I could do both. He told me to start the following Monday and to bring 2 forms of identification. I walked out of there feeling like I'd won the lottery. The job itself was exactly as glamorous as it sounds. I spent 8 hours restocking chips and candy, mopping floors that never seemed to get clean, and dealing with the occasional drunk or junkie who wandered in looking for cigarettes or lottery tickets. Frank had given me strict instructions about what to do if anyone tried to rob the place, which basically amounted to giving them whatever they wanted and not being a hero. The cash register never had more than $50 in it anyway, and the cameras recorded everything. It wasn't the career I dreamed about during those long nights at the group home, but it was honest work, and it paid. That was more than a lot of people in my situation could say. The problem was that even with the job, I still couldn't afford an actual apartment. First and last month's rent, plus a security deposit, plus proof of income and references. I might as well have been trying to buy a mansion. I looked into renting a room, but even the sketchy places wanted more than I could afford, and most landlords took one look at my age and decided they didn't want the liability. So I continued my rotation between the shelter when I could get a bed, sleeping in the park when I couldn't, and occasionally splurging on a motel room when I desperately needed a real shower and a few hours of uninterrupted sleep. It wasn't sustainable, and I knew it. But what choice did I have? At least I was working. At least I was trying. About 3 weeks into this routine, something strange happened. I came back to the shelter one afternoon after catching a few hours of sleep in the park, and the front desk attendant told me someone had been looking for me. "A lawyer," she said, which made my stomach drop. What could a lawyer possibly want with me? I didn't owe money, hadn't committed any crimes, and I certainly didn't have anything worth suing over. The attendant handed me a business card for someone named Patricia Goldstein, attorney at law, with an address in the nice part of town where buildings had doormen and people wore suits that cost more than I'd made in the past month. There was a handwritten note on the back that said, "Regarding the estate of Dorothy Mitchell, please call at your earliest convenience." Dorothy Mitchell, my grandmother. I stood there staring at that card for a solid 5 minutes, trying to make sense of it. My grandmother had died when I was 15, 3 years ago, while I was still bouncing between foster homes and trying to survive middle school. Nobody had told me about a funeral. Nobody had asked if I wanted to say goodbye. I'd found out about her death almost 6 months after it happened, when a social worker casually mentioned it while reviewing my file. Apparently, there had been some kind of dispute about who should take custody of me, but since my grandmother had been in her 80s and living alone on some farm in the middle of nowhere, and since I was already in the system, they'd decided it was better to leave me where I was. Better for who, I'd always wondered, but never asked. I used the shelter's phone to call the number on the card, half expecting it to be some kind of scam or mistake. But Patricia Goldstein answered on the second ring, and her voice had that professional warmth that expensive lawyers cultivate. She asked if I was Rebecca Ann Morrison, born April 7th, and when I confirmed, she told me she'd been trying to locate me for several months. Apparently, settling my grandmother's estate had been complicated by the fact that I'd moved around so much and aged out of the system right when they'd finally tracked me down. She asked if I could come to her office the following Tuesday at 2 p.m. I told her I'd be there, even though I had no idea how I was going to stay awake after working all night. That weekend felt endless. I kept replaying the conversation in my head, trying to figure out what it could mean. Had my grandmother left me something in her will? Money, maybe? Even a few $1,000s would change everything. I could get an apartment, buy some decent clothes, maybe even enroll in community college, like Mrs. Chen had suggested. I tried not to get my hopes up too high, because hope was dangerous when you'd been disappointed as many times as I had, but I couldn't help imagining different scenarios. At work, I caught myself daydreaming instead of stocking shelves, and Frank had to snap me back to reality twice. I apologized and focused, but my mind kept wandering to that farm my grandmother had supposedly lived on, wondering what it looked like, whether she'd thought about me before she died. Tuesday finally arrived, and I did my best to make myself presentable. I'd splurged on a cheap blazer from Goodwill and spent extra time making sure my hair looked decent. The law office was in a glass tower downtown, the kind of building where people spoke in hushed tones and everything smelled like expensive coffee and leather furniture. The receptionist looked at me like I might be lost, but when I gave my name, her expression shifted to something approximating professionalism. She directed me to a conference room on the 14th floor and offered me water, which I accepted because my mouth had gone completely dry. Patricia Goldstein was younger than I'd expected, maybe late 30s, with sharp features and kind eyes that suggested she actually cared about her clients instead of just their billable hours. She shook my hand firmly and gestured for me to sit down at a massive conference table that probably cost more than a car. Then she opened a folder and pulled out several documents, arranging them carefully before looking up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Rebecca," she began, "I'm going to be direct with you because I think that's what you'd prefer. Your grandmother, Dorothy Mitchell, passed away 3 years ago at the age of 84. In her will, which was properly executed and filed with the county, she left her entire estate to you as her only living heir. The estate consists primarily of a property in Meadowbrook County, approximately 230 acres of farmland, along with a house, a barn, and various outbuildings. There's also a small savings account with about $12,000 in it, though most of that has been used to pay property taxes and maintain the land while we located you." I sat there, unable to process what she was telling me. 230 acres, a house? This had to be a mistake. People like me didn't inherit farms. We inherited debt and trauma and a cycle of poverty that was nearly impossible to break. Hey, if you're enjoying this story, I'd really appreciate it if you could hit that subscribe button. It helps more than you know, and it means I can keep bringing you real stories about people who refuse to give up, even when the world counted them out. Also, drop a comment and let me know. Have you ever had a moment where everything changed in an instant, where you went from having nothing to suddenly seeing a completely different future? I'd love to hear your experiences because that's what this community is all about. Supporting each other through the hard times and celebrating when things finally turn around. Patricia must have seen the shock on my face because she paused and pushed a glass of water closer to me. I took a sip, my hands trembling slightly, trying to ground myself in reality. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't happen to girls who slept in parks and worked overnight shifts at convenience stores. This was the kind of plot twist that happened in movies, not in real life, and definitely not in my life. "I know this is overwhelming," Patricia continued, her voice gentle but steady. "Your grandmother made this will about 6 years ago, shortly after your mother passed away. According to the documents, she tried to gain custody of you at that time, but the courts deemed her too elderly to take on the responsibility of raising a teenager. She was 78 then, living alone, and had some health issues that concerned the social workers. But she never stopped trying to find a way to help you. She set up this will specifically to ensure that when you turned 18, you'd have something to build a life on." The words hit me like a physical force. My grandmother, a woman I barely remembered, had been fighting for me. While I was being shuffled from home to home, while I was sitting in that group home thinking nobody in the world cared whether I lived or died, she'd been making plans to give me a future. I felt tears starting to form and blinked them back furiously. I'd learned a long time ago that crying in front of people, especially professionals, made them uncomfortable and gave them permission to dismiss you as unstable or overly emotional. "The property itself is in decent condition," Patricia went on, pulling out several photographs from her folder. "We've had a property management company maintaining the basics, keeping the grass cut, and making sure the house doesn't fall into complete disrepair. But nobody's actually lived there since your grandmother passed. The farm hasn't been operational for about 15 years. Your grandmother stopped actively farming when she was in her late 60s, though she kept a small vegetable garden and some chickens up until the end. The land has been leased to a neighboring farmer for hay production, which has generated a small income that's helped cover some of the maintenance costs." She spread the photographs across the table, and I leaned forward to look at them. The house was a 2-story white farmhouse with a wraparound porch, the kind you see in paintings of rural America. It needed paint, that was obvious even in the photos, and some of the shutters hung at odd angles, but the structure looked solid. The barn was massive, red paint faded to a dusty pink, with a gambrel roof and what looked like a weather vane on top. There were other buildings too, smaller sheds and what might have been a chicken coop, all surrounded by rolling fields that stretched to a tree line in the distance. It looked like something out of a dream, or maybe a memory I didn't know I had. "The property taxes are current," Patricia said, pulling out another document. "And the lease agreement with the neighboring farmer, a man named Robert Chen, runs through the end of next year. He's been paying $500 a month, which has been going into an account to cover expenses. That agreement can be renewed, renegotiated, or terminated depending on what you decide to do with the property. You have options here, Rebecca. You can sell the farm, which based on current market values would probably net you somewhere between $800,000 and $1 million after fees and taxes. You could continue leasing it and use the income as a supplement while you pursue other goals. Or you could move there and figure out what you want to do with it yourself. $800,000, $1 million, the numbers were so abstract they didn't even feel real. I'd spent the last 2 weeks worrying about whether I could afford a $4 meal at Wendy's. And now this woman was casually discussing amounts of money that I couldn't even properly conceptualize. My entire worldview was shattering and reassembling itself in real time, and I wasn't sure whether to laugh or cry or just sit there in stunned silence. "I know this is a lot to take in," Patricia said, and I realized I'd been sitting there without speaking for at least a full minute. "You don't have to make any decisions today. In fact, I'd strongly advise against making any major decisions until you've had time to process everything and maybe even visit the property. I've prepared all the necessary paperwork for you to take ownership. There are some forms you'll need to sign, and we'll need to get the deed transferred into your name, but that's all straightforward. The question is, what do you want to do next? What did I want to do next?" It was such a simple question with such a complicated answer. Part of me wanted to sell everything immediately, take the money, and disappear into a life where I never had to worry about where I'd sleep or whether I could afford food. But another part of me, the part that sounded suspiciously like my mother's voice in my head, was curious about this farm, about the grandmother who'd cared enough to leave it to me, about what kind of life might be possible there. I'd spent so long just trying to survive that I'd forgotten what it felt like to actually have choices. "Can I see it?" I asked, my voice coming out smaller than I intended. The farm, I mean. "Can I go there and look at it before I decide anything?" Patricia smiled, and it was the first genuine smile I'd seen from an adult in longer than I could remember. "Absolutely. In fact, I think that's a very wise decision. The property is about 2 hours north of here, in a small town called Millbrook. The house has been winterized and locked up, but I have keys for you." She pulled a small envelope from her folder and slid it across the table. Inside were 2 keys on a ring with a small wooden tag that had an address burned into it. "I can arrange for the property manager to meet you there if you'd like a formal tour, or you can go by yourself and take your time. It's your property now, Rebecca. You can do whatever you want with it." I picked up the keys, feeling their weight in my palm. They were just keys, pieces of cut metal, but they represented something I'd never had before. Security, stability. A place that was mine, that nobody could kick me out of, that I didn't have to share with strangers or earn the right to occupy. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. We spent the next hour going over paperwork. Patricia explained things in terms I could understand, never talking down to me or making me feel stupid for asking questions. She gave me her cell phone number and told me to call any time, day or night, if I needed help or advice. She also gave me the contact information for a financial advisor who specialized in helping people who came into money suddenly, people who needed guidance on how not to blow through their inheritance. The fact that she thought ahead to that she was treating me like someone capable of making good decisions with proper support, made me want to cry all over again. When I finally left her office, stepping back out into the afternoon sunlight, I felt like I was walking through a dream. I still had a shift at the convenience store that night. I still had only $112 in my pocket and nowhere permanent to sleep. But I also had keys to a farm, a house, 230 acres of land, and the knowledge that someone had believed I deserved better than what life had given me so far. My grandmother, Dorothy Mitchell, had given me a chance. Now I had to figure out what to do with it. I called Frank from a payphone outside a gas station and told him I needed to take a few days off for a family emergency. He wasn't happy about it. Said he needed reliable employees, not people who'd flake out after only a month. But when I explained that it was about an inheritance and legal matters, his tone softened slightly. He told me I could have 3 days, but if I wasn't back by Friday night, he'd have to find someone else. I thanked him and hung up, knowing that by Friday I'd probably have a much better sense of whether I was coming back at all. The next morning, I used some of my dwindling cash to buy a bus ticket to Millbrook. The ride took almost 3 hours because the bus made stops in every small town along the way, picking up and dropping off people whose lives seemed infinitely more settled than mine. I watched the landscape change through the grimy window, the city gradually giving way to suburbs, then to farmland and forests. It was early October now, and the trees were starting to turn, splashes of red and gold against the deep green of the pines. I'd forgotten how beautiful the world could be when you weren't focused solely on survival. Millbrook turned out to be exactly the kind of small town you'd expect, the kind with a main street that had a hardware store, a diner, a bank, and not much else. The bus dropped me off in front of the post office, and I stood there with my duffel bag, looking around and trying to get my bearings. According to the address on the key tag, the farm was about 4 miles outside of town. I could walk it if I had to, though 4 miles with a heavy bag wasn't exactly appealing. I was considering my options when an elderly woman came out of the post office and asked if I was lost. "Not lost exactly," I said. "Just trying to figure out how to get to Meadowbrook Road." Her face lit up with recognition. "Oh, you must be heading out to the old Mitchell place. Are you the granddaughter everyone's been talking about?" I stared at her, surprised that anyone would know about me, let alone be talking about me. In the city, you could be invisible even when you were standing right in front of someone. But apparently in small towns, news traveled fast, especially news about property changing hands. The woman introduced herself as Margaret Hensley, said she'd been friends with my grandmother for over 40 years, and before I could even process what was happening, she'd loaded me and my duffel bag into her ancient Buick and was driving me out to the farm. "Your grandmother was a remarkable woman," Margaret said, as we drove down roads that got progressively narrower and more rural. "Tough as nails, but with the biggest heart you ever saw. She talked about you all the time, you know. Had your school pictures on her refrigerator, even the ones from when you were little. She used to tell anyone who'd listen that her granddaughter was going to do great things someday. Broke her heart that she couldn't take you in herself after your mama passed." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded and looked out the window. The idea that my grandmother had kept my pictures, had talked about me, had cared about me from a distance when I'd felt so completely alone, was almost too much to process. I'd spent so many years believing I was unwanted, that I was just a burden people tolerated until they couldn't anymore, and now I was learning that someone had been fighting for me all along. It shifted something fundamental in how I understood my own story. We turned onto a gravel driveway, marked by a weathered mailbox with Mitchell painted on the side in faded letters. The driveway curved through a tunnel of trees that opened up suddenly to reveal the farm spread out before us like something from a postcard. The photographs Patricia had shown me didn't do it justice. The house was larger than I'd realized, with that wraparound porch extending around 3 sides and a chimney rising from the center. The white paint was indeed peeling, and some of the shutters hung crooked, but the bones of the place were beautiful. The barn stood proud behind the house, and beyond that, fields stretched out to distant tree lines, gently rolling hills painted in autumn colors. Margaret pulled up to the front porch and turned off the engine. We sat there for a moment in silence, and I realized my hands were shaking again. This was mine, this entire place, this beautiful forgotten farm with its peeling paint and wild gardens and 230 acres of possibility belonged to me. It didn't feel real. It felt like at any moment someone would tap me on the shoulder and tell me there'd been a mistake, that I needed to go back to sleeping in parks and working overnight shifts and living in that constant state of anxiety about where my next meal would come from. "Take your time," Margaret said gently. "I'll wait here while you look around. The key should work for both the front and back doors." Dorothy always kept the place locked up tight, even though we don't get much crime out here. Old habits from when she was younger, I suppose. I climbed out of the car, grabbed my duffel bag even though I didn't really need it, and walked up the porch steps. They creaked under my weight, but they felt solid enough. The porch boards needed replacing in spots, but the roof overhead seemed intact. There was a swing at one end, chains rusted but the seat still hanging level. I could picture my grandmother sitting there in the evenings, watching the sunset over her fields, maybe thinking about me and wondering if I was okay. The thought made my chest tight. The key turned smoothly in the lock, and the front door swung open with a groan that echoed through the empty house. I stepped inside and was immediately hit by the smell of old wood, dust, and something floral that might have been my grandmother's perfume lingering after all this time. The entry hall opened into a large living room with hardwood floors and tall windows that let in streams of afternoon light. The furniture was still there, covered in white sheets that gave everything a ghostly appearance. There was a stone fireplace along one wall, and built-in bookshelves flanking it, still filled with books that nobody had bothered to pack away. I moved through the house slowly, taking in each room. The kitchen was outdated but spacious, with yellow countertops and white cabinets that had seen better days. There was a table by the window that looked out over the back garden, or what had once been a garden and was now mostly overgrown with weeds. Upstairs, there were 4 bedrooms, all furnished, all frozen in time, like a museum to a life that had ended 3 years ago. One room was clearly my grandmother's, with a quilt on the bed and photographs on the dresser. I picked up one frame and saw a picture of a young woman holding a baby. My mother and me, I realized. I was maybe 6 months old, and my mother looked so young, probably only 19 or 20, with my same green eyes and a smile that suggested she still believed good things were possible. Another bedroom had clearly been kept for me. There was a twin bed with a faded purple comforter, a small desk, and a bookshelf filled with children's books and young adult novels. On the wall, someone had painted a mural of a meadow filled with wildflowers. My grandmother had made this room for me, had kept it ready just in case I ever came, and I'd never known it existed. I sat down on the bed and let myself cry for the first time since leaving the lawyer's office. Not sad tears exactly, but tears of grief for all the years we'd both lost, for the relationship we'd never gotten to have, for the love that had existed but never been able to reach me through all the barriers the system had put between us. When I finally pulled myself together and went back downstairs, I found Margaret in the kitchen, looking through the cabinets. She'd apparently decided waiting in the car was taking too long. She turned when she heard me and gave me a sympathetic look that suggested she knew exactly what I'd been doing upstairs. "The house needs work," she said matter-of-factly, "but it's structurally sound. Dorothy always took care of things properly. The roof was replaced about 7 years ago, and the furnace was serviced regularly. You'll need to turn the utilities back on, of course, and there's probably some plumbing that needs attention, but it's livable. Better than livable, really. It's a good house with good bones, and it's sitting on some of the best farmland in the county." She walked over to the window and looked out at the fields. "Robert Chen, he's the one who's been leasing the land for hay. He's a good man, fair and honest. If you decide to keep farming it, he'd probably be willing to help you figure things out, or at least point you in the right direction. And if you decide to sell, well, there's plenty of developers who'd love to get their hands on this much land so close to the county line. You've got options, is what I'm saying. Real options." We spent the next hour walking around the property. Margaret pointed out various features, told me stories about my grandmother, and introduced me to the basics of what I was looking at. The barn was in surprisingly good shape, though it hadn't housed animals in years. The chicken coop was falling apart, but could be rebuilt. There was an old tractor in one of the sheds that probably hadn't run in a decade. The fields were currently lying fallow, waiting for someone to decide their future. Everything felt full of potential and also completely overwhelming. By the time Margaret drove me back into town, the sun was setting and I'd made a decision. I wasn't going back to the city. I wasn't going back to Frank's convenience store or the shelter or sleeping in parks. This farm was mine, and I was going to figure out how to make it work. I didn't know the first thing about farming or maintaining property or any of the practical skills I'd need, but I'd learned how to survive on the streets with nothing. Surely I could learn how to survive in a house I owned on land that was paid for. Margaret dropped me off at the Millbrook Inn, a small bed and breakfast on Main Street, and insisted on paying for 3 nights over my protests. She said Dorothy would have wanted someone to look after me while I got settled, and she wasn't taking no for an answer. She also invited me to dinner at her house the next evening, said her husband would love to meet me, and they could help me start making a plan for what came next. I accepted gratefully, realizing that maybe I wasn't as alone as I'd thought. Maybe in leaving behind everything I'd known, I was actually finding something I'd been missing my entire life: community. That night, lying in an actual bed with clean sheets and a locked door between me and the world, I called Patricia Goldstein's cell phone. She answered on the 3rd ring, sounding pleased to hear from me. I told her I wanted to keep the farm, at least for now. I wanted to try living there and seeing what was possible. She said she'd start the paperwork to get everything finalized and transferred into my name. She also gave me some practical advice about opening a bank account, setting up utilities, and finding local contractors who could help with repairs. Before we hung up, she said something that stuck with me. Your grandmother believed in you, Rebecca. She saw something in you worth investing in, worth planning for. Don't waste that gift by being afraid to try and fail. The worst thing you can do is play it safe and wonder what might have been. I promised her I wouldn't, and I meant it. For the first time in my life, I had something to build toward instead of just something to survive. It was terrifying, but it was also the most hopeful I'd felt in longer than I could remember. The kids at the group home who'd laughed at me, who'd bet on how quickly I'd fail, they had no idea what I was capable of. Hell, I had no idea what I was capable of, but I was about to find out. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity that left me exhausted but more alive than I'd felt in years. Margaret and her husband Tom became my unofficial guides to rural life, introducing me to everyone who mattered in Millbrook and helping me navigate the practical realities of taking over a farm. Tom was a retired contractor who still kept his hand in with small projects, and he walked the property with me, making lists of what needed immediate attention versus what could wait. The roof was solid, thank God, but the porch needed reinforcement. Several windows had seals that were failing, and the entire house needed fresh paint inside and out. Robert Chen, the farmer who'd been leasing the land, turned out to be exactly as Margaret had described. A good man with an honest handshake and a straightforward way of talking. He was in his mid-50s, had been farming in the area his entire life, and he genuinely liked my grandmother. When we met to discuss the lease, he brought his wife Linda and a homemade apple pie that she insisted was just a welcome gift. We sat at my grandmother's kitchen table, the same one where she'd probably eaten thousands of meals, and talked about the land. Your grandmother's property is some of the best soil in the county, Robert explained, his weathered hands wrapped around a coffee mug. Good drainage, decent slope, protected from the worst winds by those tree lines. Right now I'm just cutting hay off it, which is fine, but not exactly lucrative for either of us. If you're planning to stay and work the land yourself, there's a lot more you could do with it. Vegetables, if you want to go the farmer's market route. Maybe some livestock if you're feeling ambitious, or you could look into the organic certification process and lease it to someone who specializes in that. The demand for organic hay and feed is growing every year. Udum. I admitted I didn't know the first thing about farming, which made Robert laugh, but not in a mean way. He said most people who inherited farms were in the same boat, and the ones who succeeded were the ones willing to learn and not too proud to ask for help. He offered to extend the current lease for another year at the same rate, which would give me steady income while I figured things out, and in exchange he'd teach me the basics of land management. It seemed like more than a fair deal, and we shook on it right there at the table. The bank account situation was surprisingly straightforward thanks to Patricia's guidance. The $12,000 that remained from my grandmother's savings was transferred to a new account in my name, along with the monthly lease payments from Robert. I also applied for and received a small business loan to cover immediate repairs and improvements to the property, something Patricia had helped me prepare for by getting all the estate documents in order. For someone who'd been homeless a month ago, suddenly having access to actual money felt surreal. I found myself checking my account balance multiple times a day just to make sure it was real. I threw myself into fixing up the house with an intensity that probably wasn't entirely healthy, but I needed to stay busy. Staying busy meant I didn't have time to second-guess myself or wonder if I was in over my head. Tom and a couple of his semi-retired buddies helped with the major repairs, charging me for materials but donating most of their labor because, as Tom put it, Dorothy had been good people and they wanted to see her place restored. We replaced rotted porch boards, sealed windows, fixed plumbing issues, and gave the whole house a fresh coat of paint, inside and out. I chose a warm cream color for the interior walls and kept the exterior white, but with new black shutters that actually hung straight. The bedroom my grandmother had made for me became my project. I kept the wildflower mural, but painted the other walls a soft sage green. I bought a new mattress, actual adult bedding, and slowly began adding pieces that made the space mine. A reading chair by the window, a better desk for the laptop I'd bought with some of my inheritance money, curtains that I'd sewn myself from fabric I found at a store in the next town over, surprising myself with how much I enjoyed the meditative process of creating something with my hands. For the first time in my life, I had a room that was truly mine, in a house that couldn't be taken away from me, and the security of that was almost overwhelming. I started exploring the property more thoroughly, walking the fence lines and discovering things I'd missed on that first day. There was an old greenhouse behind the barn, glass mostly intact, that could be restored, a spring-fed pond in the back 40 acres that was full of cattails and bullfrogs, an orchard that had gone wild but still had apple and pear trees that produced fruit, though nobody had been harvesting it. Every discovery felt like unwrapping a gift my grandmother had left for me, layers of possibility I was only just beginning to understand. Margaret took me to the local farmers' market one Saturday morning, introducing me to vendors who'd known my grandmother and explaining how the whole system worked. People sold everything from vegetables to baked goods to handmade crafts, and there was a waiting list for permanent vendor spots because the market had become so popular. Several people suggested I might want to consider it once I got settled, maybe start small with whatever produce I could grow. The idea was intimidating but also exciting. I'd always been good with my hands and enjoyed working outside during the brief periods I'd gotten to try it. Maybe I could actually do this. The loneliness hit me sometimes, usually late at night, when the house was quiet, except for the sounds of the countryside that I was still getting used to. Crickets and frogs, the wind in the trees, occasionally an owl or some other night creature I couldn't identify. I missed having people around, missed the constant background noise of the city, even missed some of the kids from the group home, despite how most of them had treated me at the end. But I was learning that loneliness and being alone weren't quite the same thing. I was alone, yes, but I was also building something. That made all the difference. I'd been at the farm for almost 2 months when I got an unexpected visitor. I was in the barn, trying to organize decades' worth of accumulated junk, when a car pulled up the driveway. I came out, covered in dust and cobwebs, to find Jenny standing there with a backpack over her shoulder and tears streaming down her face. Her aunt in Colorado had relapsed, and the placement had fallen apart. She'd somehow tracked me down through the group home's records and taken 3 buses to get here, gambling that I might take her in. She was 17, had nowhere else to go, and she looked at me with the same desperate hope I'd probably had in my own eyes a few months earlier. I didn't even hesitate. I told her she could stay as long as she needed. We dragged a spare mattress into one of the other bedrooms upstairs, and that night we sat on the porch eating pizza from the one place in town that delivered, and I told her about everything that had happened, about the inheritance, about learning that my grandmother had fought for me, about all the work I'd been doing and all the plans I was starting to make. She listened with wide eyes and then asked if maybe she could help with some of it. She was good at gardening, she said, had worked on her aunt's small vegetable plot before everything went sideways. Maybe we could start planning what to plant in the spring. That moment, sitting on my porch with my friend, planning a future that included both of us, felt like everything I'd been working toward without realizing it. The farm wasn't just about me having a place to live or money in the bank. It was about creating something bigger than survival, about building the kind of life where there was room for other people who needed it. My grandmother had given me that gift, and I could pass it forward. By the time winter arrived, the house was warm and weatherproof. The immediate repairs were done, and I had a rough plan for the spring. Robert had convinced me to try my hand at a market garden, starting small with just a 1/4 acre of vegetables. He'd help me prepare the soil and teach me the basics, and Linda had offered to show me how to can and preserve whatever I managed to grow. Jenny and I spent the cold months reading everything we could about sustainable farming, drawing up garden plans, and slowly turning the house into a real home. I called Frank at the convenience store one night to officially quit, apologizing for disappearing the way I had. He was surprisingly understanding. Said he'd figured something major had happened because I'd seemed like the type who showed up when she said she would. He wished me luck, and I hung up, feeling like I was closing a chapter on a part of my life I'd never have to return to. The people who'd laughed when I left the group home with nothing, who'd bet on how quickly I'd fail, they had no idea what I'd built in the months since then. They didn't know about the farm or the friends I'd made, or the future I was creating from the ashes of what had looked like complete disaster. And honestly, I didn't need them to know. I wasn't doing this to prove them wrong. I was doing it because my grandmother had believed I was worth believing in, and I was finally starting to believe it myself. If you've made it this far, thank you for being here. This community means everything to me, and I love hearing your stories as much as I love sharing mine. If this resonated with you, please consider subscribing and joining our family here. Hit that like button, share this with someone who might need to hear it, and drop a comment below. I want to know, what's the biggest lesson you learned from this story? Have you ever had someone believe in you when you didn't believe in yourself? Or maybe you're going through something hard right now and need to hear that things can turn around when you least expect it. Whatever it is, share it with us. We're all in this together, and your story matters just as much as mine. Until next time, remember that your worth isn't determined by where you started, but by what you choose to build with what you're given.